In 1997, a young couple vanished from a mountain cabin on their first anniversary, leaving behind a half-eaten dinner and no trace. But 27 years later, when a wildfire splits an ancient pine tree down the middle, firefighters discover their wedding rings sealed in amber sap, and what they find in the hidden canyon will reveal a love so consuming it swallowed 2 people whole. Hit subscribe for more strange disappearances, haunted cold cases, and reality-bending investigations. Because every case starts with what's missing and ends with what was never supposed to be found. The fire had burned for 3 days before the wind finally died, leaving Whispering Ridge draped in silence and the smell of things that should have stayed buried. When the crews moved in to clear the deadfall, they found the old pine first. 60 years of mountain growth split clean down the middle like God had taken an axe to it. The tree had been magnificent once. Timber Creek locals remembered climbing it as children, carving initials in its bark, making wishes against its massive trunk. Now it stood broken, its heartwood exposed to gray morning light, and nested in that pale center like sleeping birds were 2 gold wedding bands. "Jesus Christ," muttered Jake Morrison, pulling off his hard hat as he stared into the split trunk. "How long you figure those have been in there?" His partner Tommy leaned closer, careful not to disturb what looked like evidence of something. The rings sat in a pocket of amber-colored sap that had hardened around them like glass, preserving them perfectly. Through the resin, he could make out engraving on the inside of the bands. "Can you read what it says?" Tommy squinted. "Looks like names. Noah and Claire. And a date. May 3rd, 1996. Jake stepped back from the tree, something cold crawling up his spine. "Morrison's books," he said slowly. "That's my uncle's place down in town. He used to tell a story about a couple who disappeared up here. Young folks, rented the Henderson cabin for their anniversary." "When was that?" "Long time ago. 27, 28 years maybe." Jake looked around at the burned forest, at the blackened stumps reaching toward the sky like accusatory fingers. They never found them. Just an empty cabin with dinner still on the table. Tommy photographed the rings from every angle before calling it in. The 911 dispatcher sounded bored until he mentioned the names and the date. Then suddenly she was asking him to repeat everything twice, to spell the names, to confirm the location. "We're sending someone up," she said finally. "Don't touch anything else." They waited by the tree, smoking cigarettes and watching ash fall like snow. Neither of them wanted to get too close to the rings again. There was something wrong about them. Something that made Jake think of promises that had nowhere to go, of love letters sealed in a time capsule that was never meant to be opened. "Weird place to put wedding rings," Tommy said. "Unless you didn't put them there yourself." 20 minutes later, Sheriff Tom Kowalski's cruiser wound up the mountain road, followed by the county coroner's van and a fire department SUV. The convoy moved slowly through the burned landscape, past trees that looked like skeletons and stumps that glowed red at their centers. Tom had been sheriff for 30 years, had worked every kind of case the mountains could throw at him. But the call about rings in a tree had made his coffee taste like ash. He remembered the Martin case, remembered the way the whole thing had felt wrong from the beginning, like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. He parked beside the split pine and walked over to where Jake Morrison waited with the evidence. The rings looked smaller than he'd expected, more fragile. Just 2 thin bands of gold that had somehow survived nearly 3 decades sealed in tree sap, waiting for a fire to crack their hiding place open. 1996, he muttered, reading the engraving through the amber. That's their wedding year. They disappeared the following May, on their first anniversary. What happened to them? Tommy asked. Tom studied the rings, thinking about the Henderson cabin with its cold fireplace and half-eaten dinner, about search teams that found nothing, about a case file that had grown thicker with questions and thinner with answers. Nobody knows. They just vanished. The coroner bagged the rings carefully, treating them like what they were. Evidence in a case that had been cold for 27 years. But as Tom watched the amber-colored sap catch the morning light, he couldn't shake the feeling that these weren't just wedding rings. They were a message, a breadcrumb trail left by people who knew they were about to disappear. Sheriff. Jake Morrison stepped closer, lowering his voice. My uncle, he always said there was something strange about that couple. Said they came into his bookstore a few times before they vanished, and the woman looked how? Haunted, like she was already half gone. Tom nodded slowly. He'd seen that look before in missing persons cases that never made sense, in people who seemed to fade away from their own lives before they disappeared from everyone else's. Claire and Noah Martin had rented the Henderson cabin for a romantic anniversary weekend and never came home. Their car was found at the cabin, keys still in the ignition. Their clothes were hanging in the closet. Their dinner was on the table, wine still in the glasses. But no footprints led away from the cabin. No signs of struggle. No blood. No broken windows. No evidence that anything violent had happened there. Just two people who had walked into the mountains and evaporated like morning mist. "We need to call Dr. Hayes," Tom said finally. "She might want to take a look at this." "The therapist?" "She specializes in complicated relationships. And if there's one thing I learned in 30 years of law enforcement, it's that people don't disappear without a reason. Sometimes that reason is murder. Sometimes it's suicide." He looked at the rings again, golden and perfect in their amber prison. "And sometimes it's something else entirely." As the evidence crew worked around the split tree, Tom thought about the Henderson cabin sitting empty in the woods, about dinner plates that had been gathering dust for 27 years, about two people who had loved each other enough to vanish from the world completely. The rings had been waiting all this time, sealed in the heart of a living tree, protected from everything except fire. Now they were evidence again, questions with golden bands around them, promises that had outlasted the people who made them. Somewhere in the burned forest, a cabin waited in perfect preservation, its door still open to the mountain air, its secrets still locked inside like rings in a tree. Tom walked back to his cruiser and pulled out his radio. Dr. Marla Hayes had been working with the county for 5 years now, consulting on cases where the psychology mattered more than the evidence. Domestic situations that turned deadly, missing persons who might have chosen to disappear, relationships that burned so hot they consumed everything around them. He dialed her number and listened to it ring once, twice. "Dr. Hayes speaking. Marla, it's Tom Kowalski. Sorry to call so early, but we've got something up on Timber Creek Road you might want to see." There was a pause, the sound of coffee being set down carefully, like someone trying not to wake sleeping ghosts. "What kind of something?" "Fire crew found wedding rings sealed inside a tree. Names match a missing persons case from 1997, Noah and Claire Martin. Young couple. Disappeared from the Henderson cabin on their first anniversary." The silence stretched longer this time, filled with the weight of 27 years and all the questions that had never found answers. When Dr. Hayes spoke again, her voice had changed, become more careful, like someone stepping around broken glass in the dark. "I remember reading about that case. They never found any trace of them." "That's right. And now we've got their wedding rings preserved in tree sap like some kind of—" Tom paused, searching for words that could capture the wrongness of it all. "Like some kind of shrine. I'll be there in 20 minutes. The drive to Timber Creek Road took 20 minutes through forest that looked like a graveyard. Blackened trees stood at attention on either side of the narrow mountain road, their branches reaching toward gray sky like broken fingers. Smoke still curled up from hidden places where embers waited patiently for wind. She found the sheriff's car parked beside what had once been a magnificent pine. Now the tree stood split down the middle, its heartwood exposed like a wound that wouldn't heal. The evidence crew was packing up their equipment, but Tom Kowalski waited by the trunk with a cardboard box tucked under his arm. "Dr. Hayes." He nodded as she approached. "Thanks for coming up. Where are the rings now?" "Coroner's office. Being photographed and documented." Tom gestured toward the split tree. 27 years they were in there. Makes you wonder what else these mountains are hiding. Marla stepped closer to examine the tree's interior. The wood was pale and clean where it had split, but she could see the dark amber stain where the rings had been nested, like a wound that had healed around something foreign, something that didn't belong. "Tell me about the original case." Tom opened the cardboard box and pulled out a manila folder thick with age. "Noah and Claire Martin, married May 3, 1996. She was 25, worked as a bank teller in town. He was 28, freelance photographer. They rented the Henderson cabin for their first anniversary. He handed her a photograph clipped to the inside of the folder. A young couple at what looked like a church reception. Claire in white lace, Noah in a dark suit. They were pressed close together, her hand on his chest, his arms wrapped around her waist. But something about their expressions made Marla's stomach tighten. Claire's smile was too bright, too desperate. Noah's eyes held an intensity that looked more like hunger than happiness. They checked into the cabin on Friday, May 2nd, Tom continued. We're supposed to check out Sunday morning. When they didn't show, Mrs. Henderson drove up to see what was wrong. What did she find? Dinner on the table. 2 place settings, food still on the plates. Wine glasses half full. Fireplace burning low but still warm. Their car was in the driveway, keys in the ignition. Clothes hanging in the closet. Toiletries in the bathroom. Tom's voice took on the flat tone of someone reciting facts that had never made sense. Front door was wide open. Marla studied the photograph again. There was something in the way Noah held Claire, something possessive in the curve of his hands against her back. She'd seen that grip before, in her office, in couples who came to her when love had become something else entirely. Any signs of struggle? None. No blood. No broken furniture. No footprints leading away from the cabin. It was like they just evaporated. Tom pulled another document from the folder. A handwritten report dated May 6, 1997. Search teams combed the area for 2 weeks. Brought in dogs, helicopters, volunteers from 3 counties. Nothing. What about their backgrounds? Any red flags? Clean as a whistle. Noah grew up in Montana, moved to Colorado for college, worked as a freelance photographer for travel magazines. No criminal record, no history of violence. Claire was local, born and raised in Whispering Ridge. High school sweetheart type. Worked at the bank since graduation. Lived with her mother until she got married. Tom handed her another photograph. This one from Claire's driver's license. The woman looking back at her was pretty in a soft, fragile way. Wide green eyes, brown hair that curled gently around her face. A smile that seemed uncertain of itself. Her mother said she changed after she met Noah, Tom continued. Got quiet, stopped seeing her friends, quit the book club she'd belonged to since high school. But Mrs. Bennett figured it was just newlywed behavior. Marla felt something cold crawl up her spine. How long were they together before they married? 6 months. Met in November 95. Engaged by Christmas. Married in May. 6 months. From stranger to husband in 6 months. Marla had seen it before. The whirlwind courtship that felt like destiny but looked like predation. The kind of love that burned so bright it consumed everything else in its path. Did you interview Noah's friends? Family? That's where it gets strange. Tom flipped through the file. He didn't seem to have any. No close friends, no regular contact with family. His landlord said he kept to himself, paid rent on time, never caused trouble. Coworkers described him as charming but distant. Like he was friendly enough but never let anyone get too close. Except Claire. Claire had gotten close. Close enough to marry him 6 months after they met. Close enough to disappear with him into the mountains. There's something else, Tom said, reaching into the box again. We found this in Claire's car, locked in the glove compartment. He handed her a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. The cover was soft with wear, like something that had been held often, read and reread by hands that needed to remember. Marla opened to the first page and felt her breath catch. The handwriting was careful, precise. The writing of someone who believed words had power, who thought documenting feelings would somehow make them real. March 15, 1997. I met Noah at Morrison's Books today. I was just picking up Mom's romance novel when I saw him in the poetry section, reading Neruda like it was a love letter meant just for him. When he looked up and caught me staring, he smiled like he'd been waiting his whole life for me to walk into that store. We talked for 3 hours. 3 hours. I forgot about groceries, forgot Mom was expecting me for dinner, Forgot everything except the way Noah's eyes crinkle when he laughs and how he listens like every word I say matters. He's traveled everywhere, Montana, Wyoming, the Dakotas, documenting small towns before they disappear. But he says Whispering Ridge feels different. Says it feels like home. He asked me to coffee tomorrow. I said yes before I could think of reasons to say no. Mom always says I fall too fast. But this doesn't feel like falling. This feels like flying. Marla closed the journal, her hands trembling slightly. She knew this story. She'd lived the beginning of this story 15 years ago, in a different town with a different man who'd made her feel like she was flying right up until the moment she realized she was falling. Dr. Hayes? You look like you've seen a ghost. She had seen a ghost. She'd seen herself at 25, writing similar words in her own diary about a man who'd made her feel chosen, special, understood in ways no one else ever had. A man who'd slowly, carefully separated her from everything that made her who she was until she almost forgot she'd ever been anyone at all. Sheriff, she said carefully, I think we need to look at this case differently than you did in 1997. How so? Marla looked at the split tree, at the amber stain where 2 wedding rings had waited 27 years to be found. I don't think the Martins were victims of a crime. I think they were victims of something much more complicated than that. She tucked the journal under her arm, feeling its weight like a stone against her ribs. Somewhere up in these mountains, a cabin sat empty and waiting, its door still open to the forest air. And somewhere in the pages of Claire's journal was the story of how 2 people could love each other so completely that they disappeared from the world rather than exist apart. The kind of love that felt like salvation but looked like suicide. The kind of love that left rings in trees and questions that burned for 27 years. March 22nd, 1997, Claire's journal. Noah came to see me at lunch today with wildflowers and coffee that tasted like cinnamon. He showed me pictures from this ghost town in Wyoming. Empty houses with dinner still on the tables, like everyone just walked away mid-bite. Beautiful, isn't it? He said. How perfect everything looks when it's finally quiet. I told him it looked lonely, but he laughed. Only if you don't have the right person to be quiet with. Then he looked at me with those eyes and said I was the only person he'd ever met who understood that silence could be sacred. My heart did this fluttery thing. Marla's coffee had gone cold in her hands. She sat in Tom's office reading by the late afternoon light, the manila folder spread between them like a dissection. The handwriting was so young, so hopeful. She quit the bank 2 weeks after this, Tom said quietly. Marla turned the page. March 29th, 1997. I did it. I actually did it. Gave notice at the bank today and Mr. Henderson got all red-faced saying I was throwing my life away, but Noah was right. I was already throwing it away, just slowly, one boring day at a time. Noah was waiting in the parking lot when I came out, and when I told him, he actually cried. Happy tears. He said most people are too scared to choose love over security. We drove up to this cabin he knows about to celebrate. It's so quiet up there you can hear your own heartbeat. Noah says Mrs. Henderson lets him use it sometimes for his photography work. We could rent it for our anniversary. Make it our place. Just ours. Something cold moved through Marla's chest. She'd written words like that once, about a different cabin, a different man who'd made her feel chosen. The Henderson cabin, she said. Tom nodded. He'd been there before, multiple times. April 3rd, 1997. Noah thinks I should get my own place. He says living with Mom keeps me stuck in old patterns, that I'll never know who I really am with all those expectations hanging over me. He found this tiny apartment above Morrison's books, just big enough for the important stuff. Noah says when you have each other, you don't need much else. Told Mom tonight. She cried, which made me feel awful, but Noah says guilt is just how families control you. He says they call it love, but it's really fear. I don't want to hurt her, but I don't want to stay small either. Marla's throat felt tight. She remembered her mother's tears, remembered Michael holding her afterward, whispering that families always made everything about themselves. She moved out 3 weeks before they disappeared, Tom said. Mrs. Bennett said it was like watching her daughter become a stranger. April 15th, 1997. The apartment is perfect. Noah helped me move and he was right. I didn't need most of that stuff anyway. Just clutter weighing me down. He's been staying over. We cook simple meals, read poetry by candlelight, talk until sunrise. It's like we're the only real people in a world full of sleepwalkers. Sometimes when we're lying in bed, I can't tell where I end and he begins. Is that what love is supposed to feel like? Like drowning but not wanting to breathe? Marla's hands were shaking now. She'd written those exact words once, in her own diary, about the feeling of dissolving into someone else until you forgot you'd ever been separate. Dr. Hayes. Tom's voice seemed to come from very far away. You okay? She wasn't okay. She was 28 again, sitting in Michael's cabin while he explained why her friends didn't really understand her, why her job was holding her back, why their love was too special for other people to comprehend. April 28, 1997. 5 days until our anniversary. Noah's been planning something special. Somewhere we can be completely alone. He says the world is too noisy, too full of people who want to pull us back into their small lives. I know he means the cabin. The way his eyes lit up when he talked about it, how peaceful we felt there. Like time stopped. Like nothing existed except us. I can't wait to disappear with him. 5 more days. Marla closed the journal and sat in the silence of Tom's office. Outside, normal life continued. Cars passing, children laughing. The ordinary sounds of people living separate, individual lives. She sounds happy, Tom said. Marla looked at him across the desk covered in 27 years of questions. Happy. Yes, Claire sounded happy. The same way Marla had been happy in those last weeks before she'd almost lost herself completely. Tom, she said, standing abruptly. I need to see that cabin. Now. Now. She tucked the journal under her arm. Because I think I know what we're going to find there. The forest felt different as they drove up the mountain road. Heavier. Like the trees were holding their breath, waiting for something that had been promised 27 years ago and still hadn't come. Marla stared out the window at the passing pines and tried not to think about the last entry in Claire's journal. The one Tom hadn't shown her yet. The one written 5 days later on their anniversary, in handwriting that looked different somehow. Less careful. More desperate. The one that said, "We're ready now." The Henderson cabin sat in a clearing like something that had been waiting 27 years for visitors who would never come home. As Tom's cruiser wound up the narrow dirt road, Marla felt the silence deepen with each turn, pressing against the windows like something alive and patient. The trees grew thicker here, their branches weaving a canopy so dense that even late afternoon sunlight felt muted, strained through green filters that made everything look underwater. Mrs. Henderson stopped renting it out after they disappeared, Tom said, parking beside what had once been a small garden. Now wild grass and volunteer saplings had claimed the space, creating a tangle of green that looked like nature trying to erase human intention. Said it felt wrong, taking money for a place where something terrible had happened. But as Marla climbed out of the car and looked at the cabin, terrible felt like the wrong word. The building was small but carefully maintained, its log walls weathered to a soft gray that blended with the shadows like camouflage. Flower boxes still hung beneath windows that held their original glass, though the flowers had long since died and dried into brown skeletons that rattled in the breeze. Someone had recently cleared the worst of the vegetation from the front porch, and the wooden steps looked solid, cared for. Mrs. Henderson comes up here sometimes, Tom explained, following her gaze. Says she can't bring herself to let it fall apart completely, even though she won't rent it out. Like she's keeping it ready in case they come back. The porch boards creaked under their weight as they climbed the steps, a sound that seemed too loud in the cathedral silence of the forest. Tom produced a key from his pocket, the same key that had been found in Noah and Claire's car 27 years ago. Door was standing wide open when we found it, he said, sliding the key into the lock with a soft click that echoed like a gunshot. Like they'd walked out expecting to come right back in 5 minutes. The door swung open with a whisper, and Marla stepped into a room that felt suspended in amber. The air was thick and still, carrying the scent of old wood and something else. Something sweet and cloying that made her think of flowers left too long in water. The living area was small but comfortable, dominated by a stone fireplace with a mantel that held dried wildflowers in mason jars. their stems brittle as old bones. A sofa faced the fireplace, its cushions still bearing the faint impressions of bodies that had sat there nearly 3 decades ago. But it was the dining table that made Marla's breath catch in her throat. 2 place settings sat exactly as they'd been left. White ceramic plates held small portions of food that had mummified over the years, creating abstract sculptures of what might once have been bread, cheese, fruit. The portions were delicate, careful. Not the hearty meal of people expecting to go hiking or do physical labor, but the precise offerings of ceremony. Wine glasses caught the filtered light, their bowls stained dark at the bottom where the last toast had dried to a residue that looked like dried blood. Cloth napkins were folded beside each plate with the precision of a restaurant table setting. In the center, white candles had burned down completely, leaving pools of wax that had hardened into miniature landscapes of peaks and valleys. And rising from the center like a monument to something already dead, a bouquet of wildflowers stood in a water glass, their stems still upright though their petals had long since fallen to create a brown carpet around the base. "Jesus," Marla whispered, the words seeming to hang in the stale air like incense. "Mrs. Henderson cleaned up the perishables years ago," Tom said quietly, his voice careful and respectful, like someone speaking in a church. "But she left everything else exactly as we found it." Said it felt like disturbing a grave. Marla walked slowly around the table, studying the scene with the attention of an archaeologist examining an ancient ritual site. The wine glasses held just enough residue to suggest a toast, not a casual dinner drink, but something ceremonial. The food portions were small enough that they could have been finished easily, completely. This wasn't an interrupted meal. This was a Last Supper, planned and executed with the precision of people who knew exactly what they were doing. She moved into the kitchen, a galley space that connected to the main room through an archway that framed the dining table like a picture. Here, the evidence of intentionality became even more clear. The sink held 2 wine glasses, rinsed clean and placed carefully side by side. A cutting board sat on the counter beside a knife, both wiped spotless. Every surface was clean, organized, peaceful, the work of people who had taken time to put their affairs in order. "They did the dishes," she called to Tom, though her voice sounded strange in the dead air. "Cleaned up after themselves. People don't do that if they're being taken against their will." The refrigerator hummed softly, the only sound in the oppressive quiet. Inside, she found it nearly empty except for a bottle of champagne, still unopened, and a small plate covered with plastic wrap. She lifted the wrap carefully and found what looked like chocolate-covered strawberries, perfectly preserved by the cold but somehow obscene in their intact state, like organs removed from a body and kept for study. In the bedroom, the intentionality became even more pronounced. The bed was made with military precision, hospital corners tight and sheets pulled so taut you could bounce a coin off them. Clothes hung in the closet with careful spacing. A sundress that still smelled faintly of perfume, a button-down shirt pressed and ready to wear, hiking boots placed side by side with their laces tied in neat bows. Everything waited in perfect order, as if the occupants had simply stepped out for a moment and would return to dress for dinner. On the nightstand, someone had left a single red rose in a water glass. The flower had dried over the years, its petals falling one by one to create a crimson circle around the base like a ring of dried blood. But the stem still stood upright, defiant in its preservation, refusing to give up its vigil even after 27 years of waiting. But it was the bathroom that made everything clear with a clarity so sharp it cut. The counter beside the sink was arranged like an altar. 2 toothbrushes stood in a ceramic holder, their bristles still bearing faint stains of ancient toothpaste. 2 tubes of toothpaste, deodorant, soap, shampoo, all the ordinary toiletries of a weekend getaway, arranged with the precision of sacred objects. But beside them, set apart like offerings to some unknown god, were 2 small piles of jewelry that made Marla's hands shake. Claire's wedding ring and a simple gold watch with a delicate chain lay in one pile. Noah's wedding band and a silver necklace with a small pendant formed the other. The metal had tarnished slightly over the years, but the arrangement was still perfect, still intentional. These weren't items dropped in haste or torn off in struggle. They were gifts, offerings, symbols deliberately left behind by people who no longer needed them. And propped against the mirror, written on Henderson cabin letterhead in Claire's careful handwriting, was a note that read like a suicide letter and a love poem combined into something that made Marla's chest feel hollow. For whoever finds this, we're sorry for any worry we've caused. But please understand that this is our choice. We're not missing. We're not lost. We found something more real than the world was ready to give us, and we're not coming back to a place that would try to take it away. Please tell our families that we love them, but we love each other more than we love the people we used to be. C&N. Behind her, Tom read over her shoulder, and she could hear his breathing change, become more shallow, more careful. The note felt warm in her hands, as if Claire's intentions were still alive in the paper, still burning with the intensity that had consumed everything else. They planned this, he whispered, but the words seemed inadequate for what they were looking at. Every single detail. More than planned it, Marla said, her voice barely audible in the thick air. They consecrated it. She walked back into the living room, seeing it now through different eyes. The sofa faced the fireplace, but it also faced the windows that looked out into the forest beyond the clearing. From here, you could watch the trees and feel completely separate from the world beyond them, completely isolated from everything except each other. The cushions still held the faint impressions of two bodies pressed close together, and she could imagine them sitting here after their ceremonial dinner, holding each other as the fire burned down to embers, making their final choice while the darkness gathered outside. The late afternoon light was fading now, and shadows were beginning to creep across the floor like fingers reaching for something they'd been denied for 27 years. Soon it would be dark, and the cabin would return to its patient vigil, waiting for visitors who had chosen never to return. But before she turned to leave, something on the mantel caught her eye. Between the mason jars of dried wildflowers was a small silver frame she hadn't noticed before, its surface dusty but unbroken. Inside was a photograph of Claire and Noah, but not their formal wedding picture. This was candid, intimate, Claire laughing as Noah whispered something in her ear, both of them pressed close together on what looked like the cabin's front porch. Their faces glowed with the kind of happiness that looked almost violent in its intensity. But what made Marla's blood run cold was the background of the photograph. Through the window behind them, barely visible in the depth of field but unmistakably present, was the massive pine tree where the fire crew had found their wedding rings sealed in amber sap. They hadn't just visited this cabin once before their disappearance. They'd been coming here for months, photographing their preparation, documenting their descent into something that was either the purest love imaginable or the most complete madness. The rings in the tree weren't a desperate message or a cry for help. They were a marker, a gravestone for the people Claire and Noah used to be before they walked into the forest and became something else entirely. Dr. Hayes. Tom was standing in the doorway, keys in hand, his face pale in the dying light. You ready to go? She slipped the photograph into her jacket pocket, feeling its weight like a stone against her ribs. Tom, we need to search the forest again. For what? We covered every inch of these mountains 27 years ago. She looked back at the cabin one last time, at the table set for two, at the jewelry arranged like grave goods, at the note that promised they were still alive somewhere in the green darkness beyond the windows. For evidence that they never wanted to be found. May 3rd, 1997, Claire's journal. Our anniversary. Noah woke me before dawn and we watched the sunrise from the cabin porch. He'd made coffee and picked wildflowers, the same kind we saw on our first walk together. He said this was the last sunrise we'd watch as the people we used to be. I asked him what he meant and he smiled that smile that makes me forget everything else exists. After today, we don't have to pretend anymore, he said. We don't have to be Claire and Noah from Whispering Ridge. We can just be us. He's right. I'm tired of being Claire Bennett who works at the bank and lives with her mother and goes to book club on Thursdays. That person feels like a costume I've been wearing my whole life. Tonight we're going to walk into the forest and never come back. Marla closed the journal and looked across Tom's desk at the case files spread between them like autopsy photos. They'd returned from the cabin an hour ago, but the smell of stale air and old secrets still clung to her clothes, her hair, her skin. Outside the sheriff's office, Whispering Ridge was settling into evening. Porch lights flickering on, families gathering for dinner, the ordinary rhythm of people living separate, individual lives. "There's more," Tom said quietly, sliding another evidence bag across the desk. "We found this in their car, wedged under the driver's seat. Missed it in the original search." Inside the bag was a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. Through the plastic, Marla could see it was a hand-drawn map. Not of roads or landmarks, but of trees. Specific trees, marked with small symbols and connected by dotted lines like a treasure map leading deeper into the forest. "Hiking trails?" she asked. "No trails match this pattern. We checked." Tom pointed to a series of X marks scattered across the paper. "But look at this." At the center of the map, drawn with careful precision, was a large circle marked with two intertwined hearts. Around it, smaller circles were connected by lines, each one labeled with dates spanning several months. The date started in November 1996, right after Claire and Noah met, and ended on May 3, 1997. Their anniversary. "They were mapping something," Marla said, studying the intricate details. "But not just the forest." "We think they were scouting," Tom said. "Finding the perfect place." Marla traced the dotted lines with her finger, following the path that led from the cabin deeper into the mountains. The final X was marked with a small star, and beside it, written in Noah's angular handwriting, were the words, "Here, forever." May 3, 1997 later. "We had our last dinner as Claire and Noah tonight. Real dinner with wine and candles and the kind of conversation that feels like praying. Noah said this was our communion, our sacrament. The last time we'd need to use names that other people gave us. After dinner, we cleaned everything, put away the dishes, folded the napkins, left everything perfect. Noah said it was important to be respectful, to show gratitude for the shelter the cabin gave us while we prepared. Then we went to the bathroom and took off our rings, our watches, everything that tied us to who we used to be. Noah arranged them on the counter like an offering. He said they were gifts for whoever found them, proof that we chose this. I started to cry. Not sad tears, but the kind that come when something inside you breaks open and lets the light in. Noah held me and said we didn't need to be scared anymore, that we were going home. Home isn't a place. Home is disappearing into each other so completely that nothing else matters. The handwriting was looser now, less controlled. The careful precision of Claire's earlier entries had given way to something that looked almost frantic, like someone writing in the dark or while moving. "Dr. Hayes." Tom's voice seemed to come from very far away. "You're shaking." She was shaking. The journal felt hot in her hands, burning with the intensity of Claire's final words. She'd read suicide notes before in her practice, in consultations with the county coroner. But this wasn't a suicide note. This was something else entirely, a love letter to oblivion, a manifesto for disappearing. "They weren't running away," she said, though her voice sounded strange and hollow. "They were running toward something." She flipped to the final page, though every instinct told her to close the journal and walk away. "We're ready now. Noah is waiting by the door with our backpack. Just water and a few things we might need for the journey. He says we won't need much where we're going. I can see the forest from the window, dark and patient. It's been waiting for us," Noah says, "waiting for two people brave enough to choose love over everything else. If someone finds this, please don't look for us. We don't want to be found. We want to be free. We want to be eternal." The entry ended there, mid-sentence, as if Claire had simply stopped being the person who wrote in journals. Below her signature, someone had drawn two hearts joined together, melting into each other until you couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. Marla closed the journal and sat in the silence of Tom's office, listening to the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sounds of normal life continuing outside. Somewhere in the mountains beyond Whispering Ridge, two people had walked into the darkness and chosen to disappear so completely that even their names had become irrelevant. "Tom," she said finally, "I need to call in a search team." "For what?" "We searched those mountains for 2 weeks in 1997. Dogs, helicopters, volunteers from 3 counties. Nothing. We were looking for bodies, she said, standing and walking to the window that faced the mountains. In the dying light, the peaks looked like sleeping giants, their shadows deep and full of secrets. We were looking for people who didn't want to be there. And now we look for people who chose to stay. She thought about the map in the evidence bag, about the careful X marks leading deeper into the forest, about two people so consumed by love that the ordinary world felt like a prison they needed to escape. They're still alive, she said, though the words felt strange in her mouth. Somewhere up there, they're still alive. Tom joined her at the window, his reflection ghostly in the glass. After 27 years? Living off the grid isn't impossible. People do it all the time. Survivalists, hermits, people who want to disappear from society. If you plan it right, if you're motivated enough. She trailed off, thinking about the preserved cabin, the careful arrangements, the months of preparation documented in Claire's journal. But why? Tom asked. Why choose that over a normal life? Marla thought about her own marriage to Michael, about the slow erosion of everything that made her herself until she was nothing but an extension of his will, about the moment she'd realized she was disappearing and the desperate fight to claw her way back to her own name, her own thoughts, her own life. Because sometimes, she said quietly, love feels like the only real thing in a world full of pretending. And if you're not careful, if you're not strong enough to maintain your own identity, she pressed her palm against the cold glass. You forget there's a difference between love and consumption. The mountains stared back at her, keeping their secrets. Somewhere in that green darkness, Claire and Noah had found whatever they were looking for. Whether it was transcendence or madness, whether they were still themselves or had become something else entirely, was a question that might never be answered. But Marla was going to try. I need a team, she said, turning back to Tom. Experienced hikers, people who know these mountains. And I need to see that map again. You really think they're still out there? She thought about the rings sealed in tree sap like promises preserved in amber. About a cabin maintained for 27 years by a woman who couldn't bring herself to let it fall apart. About two people who had loved each other enough to vanish from the world completely. I think they found exactly what they were looking for, she said. The question is whether they're still human enough to remember why they wanted it. Outside, darkness was falling over Whispering Ridge, and in the mountains beyond, something that had once been Claire and Noah Martin continued its patient vigil, waiting for the world to either find them or forget them completely. The rings had been just the beginning. The search team assembled at dawn, their breath visible in the mountain air like small ghosts. For experienced hikers led by a Forest Service ranger named Beth Kohler, who'd been working these mountains for 15 years and knew every trail, every creek, every place someone could disappear if they wanted to badly enough. Most people who go missing up here, they follow water, Beth said, spreading the hand-drawn map across the hood of her truck. Streams lead to rivers, rivers lead to civilization. But this, she traced the dotted lines with a weathered finger. This leads away from everything. The map's path wound deeper into the national forest, following ridgelines and animal tracks rather than established trails. Each X mark corresponded to elevations that would be invisible from the air, hidden in pockets of dense timber where helicopter searches would see nothing but green canopy. They knew these mountains, Beth continued. Whoever drew this understood how to stay hidden. Marla studied the final destination marked with a star. According to the topographic maps, it was a box canyon about 8 miles from the Henderson cabin. Isolated, defensible, with water from a seasonal creek and enough shelter to survive if you knew what you were doing. How long to get there? She asked. 6 hours, maybe 7 if the old logging roads are washed out. Beth folded the map carefully. But Dr. Hayes, if someone's been living up there for 27 years, they might not want visitors. They started hiking at 7 a.m., following deer paths and game trails that showed no sign of human passage. The forest was thick here, old-growth pine and fir that blocked most of the sunlight and created a cathedral-like hush broken only by their footsteps and the distant sound of running water. After 2 hours, they found the first marker. It was subtle, a small cairn of stones beside a lightning-struck tree, the kind of trail marker that would mean nothing to casual hikers but everything to someone who knew what to look for. Beth knelt beside it, examining the arrangement. "Fresh," she said quietly. "Someone's been maintaining this. Recently." They followed the cairns deeper into the mountains, each one leading them further from any established trail. The markers appeared every quarter mile or so, always at decision points where multiple paths diverged, always pointing them toward the least obvious route. "It's like following breadcrumbs," one of the hikers muttered, but to Marla it felt more like following a prayer. Each cairn was placed with the same careful precision she'd seen in the cabin, the same ritual attention to detail that had preserved two place settings for 27 years. The fourth cairn was different. Beside the stones, someone had carved symbols into the bark of a massive pine, two hearts intertwined, surrounded by words in what looked like a private language. Letters and symbols that might have meant something to Claire and Noah but were incomprehensible to anyone else. "They developed their own writing system," Marla said, photographing the carved symbols. "Like they were creating a new identity, a new way of communicating." Below the symbols, in letters she could read, someone had carved, "Strangers go back." The message was old, the bark grown over in places, but the intent was clear. Past this point, visitors weren't welcome. Beth checked her GPS. "We're 5 miles from the marked location. Still want to continue?" Marla studied the warning carved into the tree. Part of her, the professional part, the part that had learned to recognize dangerous obsession, wanted to turn back. But another part, the part that had almost disappeared into someone else's vision of love, needed to know how this story ended. "We continue." The next 3 miles were harder, the path climbing steeply through terrain that would be impossible to navigate without the carefully placed markers. Whoever had carved this route knew exactly where they were going and had spent considerable time making it passable. At the 6th hour, they reached the edge of the canyon. It opened below them like a secret garden, a oval of meadow grass surrounded by steep walls of granite and pine. A creek wound through the center, and on the far side, barely visible through the trees, was a structure that made Marla's breath catch. It wasn't a cabin. It was something between a house and a shrine, built from local stone and timber with the kind of careful craftsmanship that spoke of years of patient work. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, and around the building, someone had created terraced gardens that looked both wild and deliberately tended. "Jesus," Beth whispered. "Someone's been living here." But it was the figure that emerged from the trees that made them all freeze. She was small, thin, dressed in clothes that looked handmade from natural fibers. Her hair was long and gray, braided with what looked like feathers and small bones. When she saw them standing on the canyon rim, she stopped and stared up at them with eyes that seemed too large for her weathered face. Even from a distance, even after 27 years, Marla recognized her. Claire Martin. The woman below raised one hand in what might have been a greeting or a warning, then turned and walked back toward the stone house with movements that seemed to flow like water, like someone who had forgotten how to move through the world in straight lines. "Dr. Hayes," Beth said carefully, "what do we do now?" Marla stared down at the woman who had disappeared on her anniversary and chosen to stay lost for 27 years, who had walked away from her name, her family, her entire identity to build something new in the mountains with a man who had convinced her that love meant disappearing together. "We go down," she said, "but slowly, and we let her decide if she wants to talk." The descent into the canyon took another hour, following a path so narrow and well hidden that they would never have found it without the view from above. When they reached the bottom, the woman was waiting for them beside the creek, sitting cross-legged on a flat stone like she'd been there for years. Up close, she looked older than her 52 years, weathered by decades of mountain living. But her eyes were clear, focused, and when she spoke, her voice carried the cadence of someone who had spent a long time listening to silence. "You found us," she said simply. "Not, you found me." "Claire." Marla approached slowly, hands visible, voice gentle. "Claire Martin." The woman tilted her head, considering. "I was called that once. But names are just sounds people use to keep you separate from what you really are. Where's Noah?" She gestured toward the stone house. "He's sleeping. The winters are hard now, harder than they used to be." His body remembers being old even though his spirit is young. Marla felt something cold crawl up her spine. After 27 years in the mountains, how old would Noah be? 55, 56. But the way Claire spoke about him, the way she described his body remembering age, suggested something else. Can we see him? Claire, or the woman who had once been Claire, studied them for a long moment. Then she stood with fluid grace and began walking toward the house. He might not remember how to talk to strangers, she said over her shoulder. We've been alone so long. Sometimes we forget there are other ways to be. The stone house was beautiful in its simplicity, built with the kind of attention to detail that spoke of love transformed into craftsmanship. Inside, everything was clean, organized, purposeful. Handmade furniture, shelves lined with books, walls decorated with paintings that looked like abstract representations of mountains and sky. And in the back room, lying on a bed covered with quilts that looked woven from natural fibers, was Noah Martin. He was awake but still, his eyes focused on something beyond the ceiling. His hair was completely gray, his face gaunt in a way that suggested illness rather than age. When he saw the strangers, he turned toward Claire with a look of complete dependence, like a child seeking protection. It's all right, she murmured, sitting beside him and taking his hand. They're just visiting. They'll leave soon. Noah's lips moved, but no sound came out. He squeezed Claire's hand and continued staring at the ceiling, lost in whatever world he'd retreated to. How long has he been like this? Marla asked. Time works differently here, Claire said, stroking Noah's hair with infinite tenderness. He started forgetting the outside world first, then words, then everything except us. But that's what we wanted. To forget everything that wasn't love. She looked up at Marla with eyes that held no regret, no sadness, only a kind of terrible peace. We found what we were looking for, she said. We became eternal. Marla sat beside the creek while Claire gathered wild herbs from the terraced gardens, moving through the plants like someone who had forgotten there was any other way to live. The late afternoon light filtered through the canyon walls, creating shadows that shifted and danced across the stone house where Noah lay in his eternal twilight. How did you survive the first winter? Marla asked. Claire paused in her gathering, a handful of mint-like leaves pressed to her chest. Noah was clever. He'd been planning for months before we came here, caching supplies, learning which plants were safe to eat. He said most people die in the wilderness because they're still trying to live like they're in civilization. She sat cross-legged beside the water, sorting her herbs with the practiced movements of someone who had performed this ritual thousands of times. The first year was hardest. We had to learn how to be quiet enough to hear what the forest was teaching us. What about contact with the outside world? Supplies you couldn't make or grow. In the beginning, Noah would hike out sometimes. 10, 12 miles to the old logging roads where he'd hidden things. Medicine, tools, seeds. Claire's voice carried no emotion, as if she were describing someone else's life. But after the 5th year, he stopped going. Said we didn't need anything the outside world had to offer. Marla watched the woman who had once been Claire Martin, trying to reconcile this weathered hermit with the bank teller who had written breathless journal entries about falling in love. Do you ever miss it? Your old life? Claire looked up from her herbs, genuinely puzzled. Miss what? Working at a job that didn't matter? Living in a house full of things I didn't need? Pretending to be interested in people who only talked about the weather and their television shows? She gestured toward the stone house, toward the gardens, toward the creek that ran clear and cold through their hidden world. This is real. Everything else was just waiting. What about your mother? Your family? For the first time, something flickered across Claire's face. A shadow of the person she used to be. I think about her sometimes. But Noah helped me understand that families use love like chains. They call it caring, but really they just want to keep you from becoming who you're meant to be. The words were Noah's, delivered in Claire's voice with the certainty of someone who had repeated them so many times they'd become scripture. Marla felt that familiar chill, recognizing the echo of every controlling relationship she'd ever treated. Claire, she said gently, Your mother spent 27 years wondering what happened to you. She died 5 years ago, still hoping you'd come home. Claire's hands stilled in the herbs. She's dead. Cancer. She never stopped looking for you. Something cracked in Claire's composure. A hairline fracture in the perfect piece she'd constructed. She stood abruptly and walked to the edge of the garden, staring up at the canyon walls that had protected her from the world for 27 years. Noah said she would be happier without me, she whispered. Said families always mourned for a while, but then moved on to focus on their own lives. She never moved on. Claire was quiet for a long time, her shoulders rigid with the effort of holding something back. When she finally spoke, her voice was small, uncertain. The voice of the young woman who had once written about feeling like she was flying. Did she leave anything? Any message? Marla reached into her jacket and pulled out a photograph Tom had given her from the evidence files. It showed Mrs. Bennett in her later years, sitting in what was clearly Claire's childhood bedroom, holding a framed photo of her daughter. She kept your room exactly as you left it, Marla said. Every birthday, every Christmas. She'd buy you a present and put it on your bed, just in case you came home. Claire took the photograph with shaking hands, and for a moment, Marla saw the woman she might have become, older, weathered by loss rather than wilderness, but still recognizably the bank teller who had loved book clubs and Sunday dinners with her mother. I can't. Claire's voice broke. I can't think about this now. Noah needs me. He gets confused when I'm upset. She handed the photograph back, but Marla could see the battle playing out behind her eyes. 27 years of chosen isolation warring with a lifetime of love that had never been entirely erased. Claire, you could come back. Both of you. There are medical facilities that could help Noah. Therapists who specialize in... No. The word came out sharp, desperate. You don't understand. Out there, we'd just be two sick people who couldn't handle normal life. Here, we're eternal. We're perfect. She gestured toward the stone house with something approaching panic. Look what we built. Look what we created together. This isn't mental illness. This is love in its purest form. Is it? Marla stood, facing the woman who had spent 27 years convincing herself that isolation was intimacy, that disappearing was freedom. Or is it what happens when love becomes so controlling that it cuts you off from everything else that makes you human? Claire's face went white. You sound like them, like everyone who tried to tell us our love wasn't real. I sound like someone who almost made the same choice you did. The admission hung in the air between them like a bridge neither of them wanted to cross. Claire stared at Marla with new attention, seeing her perhaps for the first time as more than just another representative of the world she'd rejected. What stopped you? She asked quietly. Marla thought about Michael's cabin, about the slow erosion of her name, her thoughts, her will, about the moment she'd realized she was disappearing and the desperate fight to remember who she was beneath all the love that felt like drowning. I got scared, she said simply. Not of him, but of what I was becoming. I looked in the mirror one day and didn't recognize the person staring back at me. But that's the point, Claire said, though her voice lacked conviction now. You let go of who you used to be so you can become something better. Or you let go of who you are and become nothing at all. They stood in silence as the shadows lengthened, two women who had faced the same choice and chosen different paths. In the distance, they could hear Noah's voice through the open window of the stone house. Not words, but a low humming that sounded like someone trying to remember a song from a world they'd left behind. He's getting worse, Claire said finally. The forgetting is spreading. Some days he doesn't remember how to eat, how to dress himself. I have to do everything for him. That's not love, Claire. That's caretaking. It's the same thing. Love means taking care of someone completely, being everything they need. No, Marla said gently. Love means helping someone be the best version of themselves, not erasing them until they can't exist without you. Claire wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly looking fragile and much older than her 52 years. If I leave, he'll die. He can't survive without me. And if you stay? Claire looked toward the stone house, toward the man who had convinced her to disappear from the world so completely that she'd forgotten how to live in it. If I stay, we'll both disappear eventually. But at least we'll disappear together. The search team was waiting at the canyon rim when Marla finally climbed back up the narrow path. Alone. Beth Kohler took one look at her face and knew the answer before she asked the question. She's not coming back, is she? Marla looked down at the hidden valley where Claire Martin tended her gardens and cared for a man who had forgotten everything except his need for her. Where two people had found exactly what they were looking for and called it love even as it consumed them both. She made her choice 27 years ago, Marla said. She's not ready to unmake it now. But as they began the long hike back to civilization, Marla couldn't shake the image of Claire standing at the edge of her perfect prison, holding a photograph of the mother who had died waiting for a daughter who chose to stay lost. Some disappearances, she realized, were harder to come back from than death. The Whispering Ridge Community Center had seen better decades, but it was the only building in town large enough for what Marla was trying to do. Folding chairs arranged in a circle, a coffee pot that gurgled like it was dying, fluorescent lights that flickered just enough to remind you that nothing in small towns ever worked quite right. She'd started the group 6 months after finding Claire in the canyon. Survivors of consuming relationships, though most people just called it Dr. Hayes' Thursday night thing. Tonight, 8 people sat in the circle, their faces carrying the particular exhaustion of people who had almost lost themselves to someone else's version of love. Anyone want to share this week? Marla asked, though she already knew who would speak first. Sarah, a 34-year-old teacher who'd spent 3 years convinced her boyfriend's jealousy was proof of his devotion. She'd been coming for 4 months now, slowly learning to trust her own perceptions again. I drove up to the old Henderson place yesterday, Sarah said quietly, just to see it, to remind myself what almost happened. The group knew about the cabin, about Claire and Noah, about the choice that had seemed like love but was really a kind of mutual suicide. Marla had made their story part of the curriculum, a cautionary tale about the difference between intimacy and consumption. How did that feel? Marla asked. Sad, but also grateful, I guess, that I got out before it was too late. Marcus, a soft-spoken man whose ex-wife had slowly isolated him from every friend and family member, nodded. I think about that sometimes. How easy it would have been to just disappear with her. Stop fighting for my own life. What stopped you? Asked Jenny, newest to the group, still raw from her escape. My daughter. I couldn't disappear from her world, even if it meant staying visible to my ex-wife's anger. The stories continued around the circle, small victories, setbacks, the slow work of remembering how to exist as individuals rather than extensions of someone else's will. Marla listened with half her attention. The other half focused on the empty chair she'd started keeping in the circle 6 months ago. She'd driven back to the canyon twice since that first visit. The first time, she'd found it empty, the stone house abandoned, gardens beginning to return to wild. Claire and Noah were gone, though whether they'd moved deeper into the mountains or found another kind of disappearing, Marla would never know. The second time, she'd left a note weighted down with stones beside the creek. There's a place for you here when you're ready. M. The note was gone when she returned a week later, but whether Claire had taken it or the wind had claimed it remained another mystery in a story full of questions that might never have answers. Dr. Hayes. Sarah's voice brought her back to the present. You seem distracted tonight. Sorry. I was thinking about choices. Marla looked around the circle at faces that had learned to trust again, slowly and carefully, like people testing the ice on a frozen lake. About the difference between choosing to disappear and choosing to be seen. After the meeting, Marla drove through downtown Whispering Ridge, past Morrison's books where Claire had first met Noah, past the bank where she'd worked before love convinced her that ordinary life was a prison. The town looked smaller now, somehow, as if Claire and Noah's disappearance had taken something from it that could never be replaced. She parked outside the old Bennett house, now owned by strangers who had no idea their home had once been a shrine to waiting. Mrs. Bennett had died hoping, and Claire lived not knowing she'd been mourned every day for 27 years. Her phone buzzed. A text from Tom. Found something at the station. You might want to see it. 20 minutes later, She was sitting in Tom's office staring at a manila envelope that had appeared on his desk sometime during the day. No postmark, no return address, just her name written in handwriting she'd memorized from reading Claire's journal. Inside was a single photograph. It showed Claire and Noah standing beside a creek that wasn't the one in the canyon. Somewhere deeper, more remote, where the mountains kept their oldest secrets. Claire looked directly at the camera with eyes that held a clarity Marla hadn't seen during their meeting. Noah stood behind her, his arms around her waist, but his face was turned away towards something in the distance, something only he could see. On the back, in Claire's careful script, "We found what we were looking for. Thank you for understanding that some stories don't have endings, only transformations. The people we became." Below that, in different handwriting that was shaky but unmistakably Noah's, "Tell them we were happy." Marla turned the photograph over again, studying Claire's face. The woman in the picture looked older than the hermit in the canyon, more weathered, but also more peaceful, as if she'd finally stopped fighting the current and learned to swim in deeper waters. "What do you think it means?" Tom asked. Marla thought about the empty chair in her support group, about Mrs. Bennett's 27 years of hope, about the thin line between love and obsession that she walked every day in her practice. "I think it means they chose their ending," she said finally. "And maybe that's the only kind of closure some stories get." She slipped the photograph into her jacket pocket, feeling its weight like a stone against her ribs. Tomorrow she would frame it and put it on her office wall, not as a cautionary tale but as a reminder that sometimes the most profound disappearances are chosen, not suffered. Outside, Whispering Ridge settled into another quiet night, its secrets hidden in the mountains that rose like sleeping giants against the star-filled sky. Somewhere in that darkness, Claire and Noah had found whatever they were looking for, whether it was transcendence or madness or simply the courage to write their own ending rather than live someone else's story. The support group would continue meeting on Thursday nights. People would continue to find their way back from the edge of disappearing. And occasionally, someone would ask about the empty chair in the circle, and Marla would tell them about two people who loved each other enough to vanish from the world completely. Some would call it the saddest story they'd ever heard. Others would call it the most romantic. Marla had learned to call it a warning, not about love itself, but about the difference between choosing to be vulnerable and choosing to disappear, between intimacy and consumption, between finding yourself in someone else and losing yourself entirely. The mountains kept their secrets, and the rings in the tree had been just the beginning of a story that would never really end, only transform into something new with each person who heard it and recognized themselves in the space between love and letting go. In her pocket, the photograph felt warm against her hand, a final message from people who had chosen their own mythology rather than live within the boundaries of an ordinary world. And in the Thursday night circle, the empty chair waited patiently for whoever might need it next. A reminder that there was always room for one more person learning to exist as themselves rather than as an extension of someone else's vision of love. The fire that had split the tree and revealed the rings was long cold now, but the questions it had awakened continued to burn, quietly and persistently, in the hearts of everyone who heard the story and wondered what they would choose if love asked them to disappear. Some questions, Marla had learned, were more important than their answers. Some stories were more valuable as mysteries than as solved cases. And some people were meant to be remembered not for who they were, but for who they chose to become when the world asked them to decide between being seen and being consumed. The empty chair waited, patient as the mountains, ready for the next person who needed to learn the difference.